Hello and welcome to this introduction to the product canvas. My name is Roman Pichler and I'd like to spend the next few minutes explaining to you how I use the canvas. Now, the product canvas really is an alternative for a traditional product backlog. At least that's the way I've intended it. Now, a traditional product backlog, as it's described in Scrum, is simply a list of the outstanding work that needs to be done in order to get a product out, be able to provide a product. And that's perfectly okay, particularly if you're incrementally enhancing your product. But if you're making bigger changes to your product and if the user experience is important, and maybe if you have more complex user interactions, then it can be tricky to work with such a linear product backlog. It tends to be difficult to integrate UX artifacts like personas, for instance, and scenarios and workflow diagrams, but also non-functional requirements into a list. And hence, a number of people have suggested alternatives to a traditional product backlog over the years, and the product canvas is the structure that I've come up with. So let's take a look at it. As you can see, the product canvas consists of 6 sections, 3 at the top, 3 at the bottom. So let's look at them and start at the top. There we have name, goal, and metrics. Now, the name is really there so you can simply identify your product or a product release, give it a name. And nothing special really, I'm afraid, here. So let me quickly write this down. This is all about just giving your product or product release a name. Think about Windows 10 or iOS 10.1 or 2, an identifier. And then the goal allows you to reflect on the purpose of your product or the release, why you're building it, why you're providing it, what is the benefit it should provide. So for instance, should it help acquire users or should it help future-proof your product by removing technical debt? That would be examples for goals. So this is about the benefit that the product or the release should create and its purpose. And the metrics, finally, are simply success criteria that help you understand if you're meeting your goal or not, or if you have met your goal or not. So for instance, if we're talking about user acquisition, it'd probably be worthwhile to think about how do we measure that we've acquired enough users. So how many new users do we want to acquire? Where should those people come from? Those would be part of your metrics. So measurements or success criteria. Now, if you work with some of my other tools, then you may recognize those 3 sections, those 3 elements. They're taken straight from my Go product roadmap, and there's a reason for this. So you connect your product canvas with your roadmap. So you'll find the identifier or the name, the goal, and the metrics also on my product roadmap template. Now let's move on and look at the bottom 3 sections, the target group, the big picture, and the product details. Now, the target group is really there to encourage you to connect your users and customers, the beneficiaries of your product, with the requirements, the things that have to be put in place in order to create a great product. And my preferred way of capturing insights about the users and customers is to use personas. So a persona is a user model. It's a made-up fictional character. However, it should be based on first-hand experience of the market. So you should have first-hand knowledge of the users and customers. You should have met prospective customers and users before you write personas. That's what I would suggest. Otherwise, there's the danger that your personas are rather speculative, and I'm not sure that this will create a lot of value. So personas are user models. And once you've created a cast of characters in order to describe the target group, the audience, the market segment that you want to address, it's a good idea to say, well, out of all those personas, out of all those characters, who we're really building this product for? Who's it really for? and that will be your primary persona. So choose a primary persona and make it clearly visible, for instance, by putting it at the top here in this target group section. So you create some focus and alignment. So that's the target group. Again, the main idea is that you capture insights about the users and customers, and you connect your user models, your user descriptions with, well, the requirements or the various pieces that need to be done in order to provide the product. And this is where the big picture comes in. The big picture really is there to help you sketch out your product, paint a rough picture of what your product should look like and do. So it's not about describing your product in detail necessarily, certainly not initially, but again, just providing an overview and scoping the development effort. So the big picture really wants to allow you to capture UX artifacts and describe the user experience. Or maybe sketch the user experience would be another way to put it. And there are a number of techniques that you can use and a number of artifacts that you can include here. So if you have a product where the user interaction is complex, or where you have a certain workflow, think of an e-commerce website like Amazon.com, for instance, where you would typically first search for a product and then you would look at it, you would evaluate it, look at the product description, maybe pictures, reviews, then make a purchase decision and pay for the product. Then you may want to use a workflow diagram to describe this user journey, or you may want to create a storyboard, or you may want to use a story map, or maybe a textual scenario, whatever works best for you. And the idea is that you capture the workflow and you add the resulting artifacts here to the big picture section. So you may want to use a workflow diagram, or a scenario, or a storyboard, or a story map. So people sometimes ask me, how do the product canvas and story maps relate? So story mapping is a technique invented by my colleague Jeff Patton. For me, I like to integrate story maps into the canvas. But if you like to keep them separate, that's perfectly okay, of course. Just be aware that the more separate artifacts you have, the harder it tends to be to keep them in sync and make sure that there are no inconsistencies. So if you'd like to, just integrate your story maps here into the big picture of the product canvas. But the interaction is not everything. You may also want to capture the key features that your product has to provide in form of epics. So big coarse-grained user stories. So for instance, for an e-commerce website like Amazon, maybe search, or maybe a checkout would be major features that you may want to sketch out here. And don't forget about the user interface design. The big picture also wants to encourage you to capture UI design sketches and mockups. And finally, non-functional requirements such as performance or interoperability or robustness. Don't forget about those, particularly the non-functional requirements that are applicable to your entire product. They're important to take into account and capture early on, as they tend to not only influence the user experience, but also architecture and technology decisions. So it's important to pay attention to those aspects and capture them. So I write down non-functional requirements, NFRs. So that's the big picture. Again, don't make the mistake of trying to describe your product too detailed initially, but rather paint a rough picture, sketch it out, scope it, but look at all the key aspects, the user interaction, features in terms of key pieces of functionality, non-functional requirements, and the user interface design. And that leaves us with the last section, and the last section is called product details. Now, having this big picture I find really useful, but it's not enough. It's not enough to build software. The items tend to be too big, often too vague. So we now need to break them down, make them more specific, and this is where the details come in. So if you work with a process like Scrum and you run sprints, then I find it very useful to work with a sprint goal in order to set yourself an objective for the coming days and weeks. So this is really what the product details wants to help you do, really list the items that have to be implemented over the coming weeks and days. And again, if you use Scrum, consider using a sprint goal. So for instance, if we're building a product and feel that it would be good for users to register first before they use the main product functionality, so they can capture some of their preferences or some of the relevant personal details, then there may be a risk that this actually is a barrier to adoption and may prevent people from using the product. And so it'd be worthwhile testing it out. And that could be the goal of an early sprint, maybe the first sprint. And if that's our goal, then we have to derive the appropriate items or capture the appropriate items. And I like to use user stories, particularly whenever reusable working software is built, and then break those user stories out of either the scenarios or storyboards or story maps or epics in the big picture section. So user stories. Now, I generally don't order the items in the big picture part of the canvas, but I do like to order and prioritize the user stories. And I do this by taking into account their importance with regards to meeting the sprint goal. So ask yourself, how important is a story in order to meet the goal of the next cycle, of the next few days or weeks? And the ones that are more important go to the top, the ones that are less important go to the bottom. So this part of the canvas is a little bit similar to a traditional product backlog. It's an ordered list, but don't forget it's only there for the next cycle, for the next sprint. And this ensures that the amount of detailed items you carry, the inventory, if you want so, of detailed items is kept to a minimum. So there is less danger of creating items that may not be applicable, because the canvas is likely to change once you get feedback from customers and users on early product increments. So you minimize the effort of detailing items and make it easier to adjust your canvas. Now, my preference is to work with a physical canvas that's on the office wall. I think it's very powerful to stand in front of the canvas and be able to discuss together what the user experience should look like and how you want to best capture it, how you want to describe it. Remember, the product canvas really is designed for UX-rich products and also typically, for a situation where you want to make bigger changes, where there is uncertainty. Maybe because you're building a brand new product or you're taking your product to a new market or market segment. And in that case, it tends to be very beneficial to have people co-located anyway, at least for an intermediate period of time. So, my recommendation would be try, if you can, to work with a physical canvas, a product canvas that's on the office wall. Of course, you can also use electronic tools. You may choose, for instance, to capture your personas and UX artifacts in Confluence, and then have the product details in Jira and capture them on a Rapid board. So that was an introduction to the product canvas structure. I hope it was useful for you. There's more information available on my website, robinpischel.com, so go and check it out. I've also written about bits that are relevant for the product canvas in my two last books. My book Strategize touches upon personas, and my book Agile Product Management with Scrum talks about product backlog management. But as the product canvas is an alternative to a traditional product backlog, you could say it's a multi-dimensional product backlog. A lot of the recommendations are applicable. So if you have any questions or any feedback, it'd be great to hear from you. Please do reach out to me, and you can contact me via email and Twitter. All the best and good luck with your product canvas. Thank you for watching.